All right, so welcome back. It is chapter 10 of part 1 in Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. We are now going to go on a wild goose chase because if you remember, if you've stayed with me through all these other chapters, then what you remember is they found an electric motor buried in an abandoned factory called the 20th Century Motor Company. And now we're on a hunt for the people or for the person who made that motor. Dagny's convinced like that is the most important thing in the world today. And her lover Rearden, right, the creator of Rearden Steel, Rearden Metal, has now been on this goose hunt, or they're about to go on this crazy wild goose chase to find the owner of this thing, rather. So we start off with this clerk at the Hall of Records. Nobody knows who owns the factory now. I guess nobody will ever know it. So in the muddy square, so she's going on a lot about the mud. You know, it kind of reminds me of this, that sort of mud flood theory, right? The Tartarian mud flood theories where they suck all the mud out and then it ruins the ability to harness electricity from the ether and channel it through the water. So instead of like it actually being a flood, it's like they drained all the water and you can't get to it. That's just what it makes me think of. So I wrote that there because in the muddy square that had once been the center of a prosperous county seat, he looked with a faint, wistful wonder at his two unknown visitors. So this is the clerk now looking at Dagny and Rearden. The court will have to decide who owns it. If a court ever gets to it, I don't think it will. So it was sold twice at the same time and to two different sets of owners. A big scandal 2 years ago. I don't see how any judge will be able to untangle any property rights out of it or any right at all. Well, the last legal owner of the factory was the People's Mortgage Company of Rome, Wisconsin. So then they throw Rome in there, right? Mark Yance was the head of it. They discovered Mark Yance had sold the 20th Century Motor Factory to a bunch of suckers from South Dakota. He'd also given it as collateral for a loan from a bank in Illinois. He'd moved all the machinery out, sold it piecemeal. So it seems like everybody owns the place and nobody. Mark Yance is the guy who sold it to people from South Dakota and the Bank of Illinois. What happened to the factory records, their production records, their work records? Oh, there's nothing left of that now. Starnesville, I wrote here because that's the place down in the valley. Jed Starnes, he's the man who built the factory. He died 12 years ago. Can you give us the names of all the owners since? No, sir. We had a fire in the old courthouse about 3 years ago, and all the records are gone. So, of course, just like these people who are vanishing, here we go. There's a fire in the courthouse where the records to this 20th Century Motor Company existed. And, of course, that's shady knowing that that's where this motor came from. Mark Yance bought it from, meaning the 20th Century Motor Company, from Mayor Boscombe of Rome. How Mayor Boscombe happened to own it, I don't know. Where is Mayor Boscombe now? Still there in Rome. And then Dagny and Rearden basically just tell the guy, we're looking for a friend of ours. Don't worry about it. So this chapter starts off where we go to the Hall of Records and we find out a bunch of people own the company, this 20th Century Motor Company. Nobody's ever going to find out who that is. There's no reason to find it out because there's nothing left of value there. The town is shot, the equipment's been stolen, and the factory itself is in shambles. Mayor Boscombe of Rome, Wisconsin, leaned back in his chair. No use, lady, absolutely no use trying to question the folks around here. There's no factory people left. Dagny stood looking at the streets of Rome. No, there's no factory records left, said Mayor Boscombe. If that's what you want to find, lady, give it up. It's like chasing leaves in a storm now, just like leaves in a storm. So they go over how there's dusty window panes and chromium strips, and she throws radio in there. And I'm thinking that she's kind of breaking things down with like radio frequencies and different particles, but that's beyond the scope of this. Mark was a nice fellow, a nice, lively, energetic fellow. I thought he was smart enough to stay within the law, whatever's left of it nowadays. And pay attention to the law, because I did read a few chapters now ahead, and the law is going to become a big issue. Mayor Boscombe smiled. I didn't get any rake off from Mark. I didn't know what he was going to do with it when he bought that factory. Sure, he paid me quite a bit more than the old booby trap was worth. I didn't put any pressure on him to make him buy it. Wasn't necessary. I'd done him a few favors before. There's plenty of laws that's sort of made of rubber, and a mayor's in a position to stretch them a bit for a friend. That's the only way anybody ever gets rich. So stretching the law and giving people a break allows them to get rich, because there's so many laws and so much nonsense that it's stacked against letting anybody succeed, is basically what he's revealing now. What I can't stand, said Mayor Boscombe, is people who talk about principles. No principle ever filled anybody's milk bottle. So the mayor, it's revealed that the mayor buys it and then hands it off to Mark in a couple of months. And Mayor Boscombe is basically telling him, he doesn't know anything, just like nobody else knows anything. Or rather, at this moment, just like the clerk doesn't know anything. What I liked was Jed's desk, solid mahogany, old Jed Starnes. So Jed Starnes is the guy who built the factory. We already found that out. He had a stall shower with a mermaid cut in the glass, and this mayor takes it. What I find interesting is that he takes this shower door with the mermaid on it and everything, because we're going back to the water, the mud, and she's really just playing around with that now, isn't she? Whose bankruptcy sale was it? The big crash of the Community National Bank. It just about finished. The whole state of Wisconsin, sure, finished this part of it. Eugene Lawson was the head of it, the banker with a heart, they called him. He was quite famous in these parts 2 to 3 years ago. So Eugene Lawson inherits basically his parents' bank, and he's got that nice communist outlook that we keep running across in this, right? It's not about money, it's about more than money. I have a heart, but the problem is that this whole outlook doesn't produce anything, and then people are left way worse off because they're given based on somebody's need and not somebody's ability. And so this Eugene Lawson guy is, as we're about to find out, is handing out loans to people who need it, but not necessarily who can produce with the loan. Not a good recipe, right? It hit the folks pretty hard around here. They all had their life savings in the Community National. Who operated the factory when it failed? That was some quickie corporation called Amalgamated Service Inc. Just a puffball, came up out of nothing and went back to it. Where is Eugene Lawson? He's got a job in Washington in the Bureau of Economic Planning and National Resources. So this guy's handing out loans to people who can't produce anything with it. And how do they reward him? They give him a job at the Bureau of Economic Planning and National Resources, as if this is the guy that should be managing people's resources, right? You and the charming lady who is not your wife. So Mayor Boscombe is a pretty insightful guy. He's sharp, he's keen. Seems like he's got that kind of street smart to him a little bit. And he points out that Dagny is not Rearden's wife, and Rearden obviously is about to kill him. And Dagny's like, relax, calm down. So Dagny asks, why do you think I am not his wife? Lady, I've seen a lot in my lifetime. Either you're virtuous or you enjoy yourself. Not both, lady, not both. If you want a tip, lady, get yourself a wedding ring from the dime store and wear it. It's not surefire, but it helps. And then Rearden was pretty angry the rest of the way out of there. And then Dagny gets to a payphone and calls Eddie Willers, and he says, Dagny, for God's sakes, where are you? In Wisconsin, why? I don't know where to reach you. You'd better come back at once as fast as you can. What happened? There are things going on which you'd better stop them now if you can, if anybody can. What things? Haven't you been reading the newspapers? No, I can't tell you over the phone. I can't give you all the details, Dagny. You'll think I'm insane, but I think they're planning to kill Colorado. I'll come back at once, she said. So they have to go back to work now. They're out here trying to trailblaze to find out who built this motor. We run into Mayor Boscombe. We already went to the clerks. We found out Jed Starnes had built the factory, and we found out multiple people owned it. And now Eddie Willis is saying they're trying to kill Colorado. So they're trying to shut down the Rearden Rail, the John Galt line, and kill all this production that they got going on in Colorado. And more that makes me think about this sort of mud flood type of narrative, right? Because the side tunnels have been abandoned like dry riverbeds. They're in Manhattan under the Taggart terminal now. So she says, cut into the granite, clicking currents, every artery of the terminal, every outlet. So granite, currents, artery. There's something to do with the natural landscape, the currents of water, artery like the lifeblood that pumps through. And now these riverbeds are dry, and the river is something that would carry this energy, the electrical energy, that is. So Dagny placed the remnant of the motor into a vault in one of the tunnels. The vault had once contained an emergency electric generator, which had been removed long ago. She had hidden the motor where no one else would know of its existence. If she could think of some action to take against the things she had found on her return to New York, she could see no way of fighting, no rules of battle, no weapons. This was a fog like semi-clots in a not quite liquid disaster coiling toward her. So semi-clots, arteries, fog. Fog meaning we've reached the veil. We can't see past anything else right now. And the coils. So obviously in electricity, disaster is coiling toward her. The more coils it is, right, sort of the higher the voltage of the charge. The Union of Locomotive Engineers demanding that the John Galt line be reduced to 60 miles an hour, all freight trains be reduced to 60 cars. The states of Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona were demanding that the number of trains running Colorado not exceed the number of trains run in each of these neighboring states. First issue. Now we're slowing down the production of Taggart and of Colorado because the other states can't keep up. A group headed by Orrin Boyle was demanding the passage of a preservation of livelihood law, which would limit the production of Rearden metal to an amount equal to the output of any other steel mill of equal plant capacity. So basically, if Orrin Boyle himself can't produce the same amount of Rearden metal that Rearden can, then Rearden has to produce less to match him. So we're not going with the most productive person in the room. We're lowering our standards to allow Orrin Boyle to keep up. A group headed by Mr. Mowen was demanding the passage of a fair share law to give every customer who wanted it an equal supply of Rearden metal. So now Rearden can't decide who he's going to give his metal to. He has to give an equal amount to everybody that they say. A group headed by Bertram Scudder was demanding the passage of a public stability law forbidding Eastern business firms to move out of their states. So now, if you're seeing that there's more opportunity in a different state, you can't pick up your company and move. Where you could be more productive, you have to stay right where you are. Even if they're passing laws and stuff that make it almost impossible for you to put out the same amount of production and to get the kind of profit that you would want, you still have to stick it out. And I told you these laws were going to become a problem. Wesley Mouch was issuing a great many statements. The words emergency powers and unbalanced economy kept appearing in the text every few lines. Talk about such a sham, emergency powers, right? We can always create an emergency to take away your rights. She had confronted James Taggart in his office and said, I don't want to run the national economy. I want your national economy runners to leave me alone. I have a railroad to run, and I know what's going to happen to your national economy if my railroad collapses. So she knows who's going to bring the goods places. How are we going to get everything from point A to point B? People aren't going to get what they need. People aren't going to have the supplies they need. Production's going to dip. People aren't going to get fed, things like that, right? The trains stop running. If I can't do my job, the whole country's going to suffer. So what are we playing at here, Jim, right? They feel that it's not fair for us to get all the benefit of that new rail. They want a share of it too. Who wants a share of it? In payment for what? Dagny says. If you kill Colorado, what is there going to be left for your damn looters to survive on? You have always been opposed to every progressive social measure. You predicted disaster when we passed the anti-dog-eat-dog rule, but the disaster has not come. Because I saved you, you rotten fools, I won't be able to save you this time. And she really did, right? She built this whole damn John Galt line, saved all their asses, and now they're looting her. They're making her slow her trains down. They're taking their production away and lining their own pockets and taking care of their own interests in the name of need and public service and all this other nonsense. There was no action she could take against the men of undefined thought, of unnamed motives, of unstated purposes, of unspecified morality. What were the weapons, she thought, in a realm where reason was not a weapon any longer? Dimly, a thought telling her that self-interest was not Jim's motive. So dimly bringing down the light. Nothing was of so urgent an importance as the task of finding the man who made the motor. Because how can you defeat, like she's saying, what you can't define, what you can't name, what you can't state? These are not men of reason, is basically what she's saying. And you can't reason with unreasonable people. So what do you do? And she's basically saying at this point, she needs to find this person with the motor, because what is she going to do? Spend her time bargaining about 60-mile-an-hours and 60 cars and, 666, all this nonsense. She doesn't want to descend into an existence where her brain would explode under the pressure of forcing itself outside incompetence. I mean, not to outdistance incompetence. So she's stuck in a society where nobody wants you to do your best, that achievement is no longer rewarded, that competence, as Dan Konya put it, is no longer the gold standard. We're in a tough spot. So at least we have this motor in the background. At least if we can find this guy and find a way to use it, maybe things will get better, which is a noble thought. But if you see how corrupt everything is, and they're basically stealing your production now and screwing with you now, what happens when you find a free mode of production where electricity is channeled and harvested without charge? You can't be controlled. And a lot of these people aren't going to like that. Things, it's going to get deadly at that point. Rearden could not fight the gangs who demanded the laws. The choice was to fight them or to keep his mills open. He had lost his supply of iron ore. He had to fight one battle or the other, and there was no time for both. So what they were basically saying is, like, he had to get an equal supply of iron as Orrin Boyle or anybody else. So they weren't giving him iron. A scheduled shipment of ore had not been delivered. No word from Larkin. And, Larkin was his boy back. He was one of the guys who was at his house in the beginning. When summoned, Larkin appeared 3 days later than the appointment made, offering no apology, his mouth drawn tightly. After all, you can't order people to come running to your office anytime you please. And, Rearden's just trying to be calm. Why wasn't the ore delivered? I won't take abuse. I don't know why something keeps going wrong unexpectedly all the time. So, Larkin's just, he's such a little jerk. He's a little asshole. What will you do when you find that you can't afford the rail rates and that you have destroyed the lake shipping? So he's basically saying you're not shipping to people who need it, who are productive. And he's actually like using Taggart Transcontinental to ship the product, even though it's more costly for him. And then Larkin says, I am sure you wouldn't understand any consideration other than dollars and cents, but some people do consider their social and patriotic responsibilities. What responsibilities? Rearden's asking. One's public duty to support Jim's Minnesota branch line, which is running at a deficit. So he wants to support James Taggart's line in the Minnesota area because it's running at a deficit. It's running at a deficit, obviously, because the railroad either isn't doing good or Minnesota's not producing a lot. He was beginning to see the links of a sequence he had never understood. So this is Rearden. You can't expect people to sacrifice the entire steel industry of the nation to your selfish interests, Larkin says. Get out of here, said Rearden. Get out. Larkin got out. So there was abandoned mines, unlighted corners in this restaurant that he's in now, unknown hands. So Rearden's now trying to make backdoor deals so that he can get his supply of stuff. There's no other course open, thought Rearden. He knew no weapons but to pay for what he wanted, to give value for value, to ask nothing of nature without trading his effort in return, to ask nothing of men without trading the product of his effort. What were the weapons, he thought, if values were not a weapon any longer? Rearden felt a jolt of blinding anger, like an electric shock. So they're just beating home the electric at this point. Ayn Rand's really showing you the link between this electric motor, the energy itself, and the characters. When he felt the wish to fight and kill, he saw the fat, grinning face of Mayor Boscombe and heard the drawling voice saying, "You and the charming lady who is not your wife." It was his rigid honesty and ruthless sense of justice that were now knocking his only weapon out of his hands. He did not pronounce the words, but the pain was their equivalent. Who am I to cast the first stone? The sight of his family had become unbearable to him. He could not tell why. Don't hate them for your own guilt, he had told himself, but knew dimly that this was not the root of his hatred, right? He's sleeping with Dagny behind his wife's back. He's kind of rough on himself. He has that issue where he feels like he needs to atone and, punish himself for his sins, basically, and his transgressions. But his wife's pretty much a jerk, and his family's not on his side. So he should really stop punishing himself and just live his life, right? But he doesn't. He's all upset. All right, so now Lillian enters Rearden's room, and we start to see how low and depraved her thought process is, right? Rearden doesn't want to see Lillian, his wife, because he's banging Dagny, and he feels guilty. And he doesn't really like her, right? He doesn't like his wife, and she doesn't really like him, kind of, it seems. At least she's always busting his beans. She's always bothering him, making fun of him, and sort of riding him about his work ethic and his values and all of that. So she hangs out with a lot of communists, right? All those people in her crew, her Washington crew. So she says, suppose I wanted to tell you about the new novel which Balf Eubank is writing. He is dedicating it to me. Would that interest you? If it's the truth you want, not in the least. And if it's not the truth I want, Rearden felt the rush of blood to his brain. Why would you want it if it's not the truth? He asked. Now you see, that's the cruelty of conscientious people. If I answered that real devotion consists of being willing to lie, cheat, and fake in order to make another person happy, To create for him the reality he wants if he doesn't like the one that exists. No, he said slowly, I wouldn't understand it. Yeah, that sounds like nonsense to me. So if you're unhappy with where you're at, instead of you changing something, somebody else has to pretend that, you know, you're living in a different reality just to appease you. That's ridiculous. That's crazy. It's really very simple. If you tell a beautiful woman that she is beautiful, what have you given her? It's no more than a fact, and if it has cost you nothing. But if you tell an ugly woman that she is beautiful, you offer her the great homage of corrupting the concept of beauty. Why would you do that? Why would you not encourage that woman? Like maybe she's not so great looking because she hasn't been taking care of herself, or maybe she has skin problems that could be cleared up if she made dietary changes. But because you're going to now pretend like everything's okay, she's not going to make those changes, right? To love a woman for her virtues is meaningless. She's earned it. It's a payment, not a gift. But to love her for her vices is a real gift, unearned and undeserved. To love her for her vices is to defile all virtue for her sake. And that is a real tribute of love because you sacrifice your conscience, your reason, your integrity, and your invaluable self-esteem. No, I don't agree. So this is crazy, the stuff she's peddling. And you can't even believe that this guy is married to this woman who is buying into this nonsense. Because obviously, you don't have to be mean to somebody, but you also don't want to lie to them either to a degree where you can fake it all day long, but it's not virtuous if you sacrifice what you know to be true to tell somebody a lie to prop them up into this fake existence so that they can pretend everything's okay. But I mean, this is the kind of convoluted stuff that his wife's into. The type of books that Balf Eubank is writing. So Lillian really notices that Hank's a lot more relaxed. He seems a lot happier, even though he's working a lot more. At least he's working on Dagny a lot more, right? And then she says, if they pass those laws they're talking about, it will hit you pretty hard, won't it? Yes, it will, but that is a subject which is of no interest to you, Lillian, is it? Oh, but it is. She raised her head and looked straight at him. And her eye had the blank, veiled look he had seen before. So we go back to the veil, the mist, the hiding, right? There's something out of our perception at the moment. He wondered for the first time whether her spite, her sarcasm, he thought of it again, the cowardly manner of delivering insults under the protection of a smile were not the opposite of what he had always taken them to be. Not a method of torture, but a twisted form of despair. That they were actually hidden love. He thought of it aghast. It made his guilt greater than he had ever contemplated. If we're talking politics, Henry, I had an amusing thought. What is that slogan you all use so much? The sanctity of contract? Go on, he said. Darling, what for, since you understood me quite well? Do you really wish to bring me to the humiliation of complaining? I did think I had a husband who prides himself on being different from lesser men. Do you want me to remind you that you once swore to make my happiness the aim of your life, and that you can't really say in all honesty whether I'm happy or unhappy, because you haven't even inquired whether I exist? Lillian's not happy, right? And they go on to describe Lillian's dress. She was moving casually across the room, the green-yellow folds of her skirt coiling in long waves about her. So electrical waves, coils again, green and yellow. She came closer, slipped her arms around him. It was the swift, ferocious gesture of a young bridegroom. He tore her arms off his body and threw her aside. He stood paralyzed, shocked by the brutality of his own reaction. Whatever calculations she had made, this was a thing she had not expected. I'm sorry, he was broken by the triple lie. Lillian, what purpose do you live for? He asked. What a crude question. No enlightened person would ever ask it. Well, what is it that enlightened people do with their lives? Perhaps they do not attempt to do anything. That is their enlightenment. All right, yeah. So real enlightening to not do anything, to leave no mark on the world, to give no action, to produce nothing, to have no aim to accomplish anything. This is like this Balfour Bank stuff. She's got to stop reading this guy. What do they do with their time? They certainly don't spend it on manufacturing plumbing pipes. Why do you keep making those cracks? You've made that clear long ago. Your contempt means nothing to me. So Rearden's like, Lillian, I don't give a crap what you think about me or the stuff I manufacture, and that you think it's basically worthless. And Rearden says, if there's anything that you really want, if there is, I'd like to give it to you, if I can. You'd like to buy it. No, it's not that as simple as that. What I want is non-material. What is it? You. How do you mean that, Lillian? You don't mean in the gutter sense. No, not in the gutter sense. How then? You wouldn't understand it, she said, and walked out. The torture remaining to him was the knowledge that she would never want to leave him, and he would never have the right to leave. He could summon nothing for her except contempt. Total, unreasoning contempt, impervious to pity. He was willing to bear anything, leaving him in a state which was both tension and peace. Because he lay in bed, his face pressed to the pillow, thinking of Dagny, of her slender, sensitive body stretched beside him, trembling under the touch of his fingers. He wished she were back in New York. If she were, he would have gone there now at once in the middle of the night. So he can't pity her, obviously, especially when she's peddling that nonsense, from Balfour Bank and that whole philosophy about real enlightenment being without aim or without purpose or without any of that, right? Enlightened people don't ask questions and they don't, it's just nonsense. And you can see why he just doesn't even give a crap with her anymore. And she's busting his beans. And he just really wants to be with Dagny, right? So Dagny goes to see Eugene Lawson, which was the banker with a heart. If people needed money, that was enough for me. Need was my standard, Miss Taggart. Need, not greed. My father and grandfather built up the Community National Bank just to amass a fortune for themselves. My rewards were the tears of gratitude in their eyes, the trembling voices, the blessings. The woman who kissed my hand when I granted her a loan, she had begged for in vain everywhere else. All right. So I'm not going to argue with that bankers are where it's at, right? Handing out loans, charging people boatloads of interest, keeping people in debt. Not a great system, right? But there is something to be said about giving people loans, which is kind of what happened in the housing crisis in 08, right? Giving people who couldn't afford to pay off their houses loans because they bundled them in with other people. And this guy is going out and giving out loans based on need. And ultimately, it fell on the US taxpayer to bail out the banks who acted incompetently. So why, just like this book is saying, why should Eugene be going out and handing out loans to people who weren't able to produce, and he didn't even know that they would be able to make a profit to pay him back, to keep the bank going so that it could loan money to other people, right? So I came for information about the motor factory. Could you possibly recall the names of any of the engineers who worked there? And Dagny really just wants to get to the engineers, but Eugene's kind of whacked out and he just wants her to basically ask for some sort of help or something while he denies the fact that he did anything wrong. I wasn't concerned with the parasites of office and laboratory. I was concerned with the real workers, the men of calloused hands who keep a factory going. They were my friends. So she's like, oh, yeah, they were your friends? Then, do you remember anybody? And then he's like, no, I don't recall individual drops in the ocean, basically. Do you remember hearing anything about A new type of motor. Motor? What motor, Miss Taggart? I had no time for details. My objective was social progress, universal prosperity, human brotherhood, and love. Love, Miss Taggart. That is the key to everything. Okay, let's say love is, the power of love, some Huey Lewis moment going on here, right? Some Back to the Future. Maybe, love itself, your love of something, is an electrical power, a force of attunement. But the way that these people couch it is as if, I don't see how you could actually love somebody if you're handing people who can't produce anything for the community alone, and then they don't produce anything, and now the community is in ruins. And you're like, well, they needed it. They wanted it. I gave it to them. And then she talks a bit about Egyptian hieroglyphs, a Hindu goddess, which is in his office, a huge graph of bewildering mathematical detail. So now we're looking into symbols here. Mr. Lawson, Dagny says, do you perhaps recall the name of a man who headed the corporation Amalgamated Service? Who was its president? His name was Lee Hunsaker, a very worthwhile young man who's taken a terrible beating. And here we go with Lee Hunsaker. So, Miss Taggart, I could probably say that in all of my life, I have never made a profit. And then it was funny because Dagny says, Mr. Lawson, I think I should let you know that of all the statements a man can make, that is the one I consider most despicable. So Eugene Lawson is handing out money from his parents' bank to people who can't produce anything. Then the bank goes under, and he basically says, wasn't my fault, and then collects a job in Washington. How nice. I don't think I have to comment on that, right? That's pretty self-explanatory how ridiculous that is. And now we go to see Lee Hunsaker. I never had a chance, said Lee Hunsaker. He was 42. Smelled like greasy odor and cheap meat in his house. He was living with some other people. I don't know exactly what it was, but there had been something goofy going on up there, so the company went broke. I worked like a dog trying to get somebody to lend us the money, but the bastard Midas Mulligan put me through the ringer. So this guy, Midas Mulligan, the Midas touch, that's kind of his nickname, and then he changed it legally to his name because everything he literally touched turned to gold. And Lee Hunsaker's like, I'm the guy that ended Midas Mulligan, basically. And Dagny's like, well, tell me about that. What was going on here? When an economist referred to him once as an audacious gambler, Mulligan said, the reason why you'll never get rich is because you think that what I do is gambling. So there's reason, logic, backing up what he's doing. His intuition is backed up by logical reasoning. So obviously there's a bit of intuition to anybody who's that good, who's making that kind of money, who's producing on a level that Midas is. But Midas could have given Lee Hunsaker a loan, and he doesn't. Why, yes, I can, said Midas Mulligan, when he was asked whether he could name a person more evil than a man with a heart closed to pity. The man who uses another's pity for him as a weapon. I thought that was great. His first name had been Michael. The humanitarian clique nicknamed him Midas Mulligan. Mulligan appeared in court for a legal change of his first name to Midas. In the eyes of his contemporaries, he was a man who had committed the one unforgivable sin. He was proud of his wealth. 7 years ago, Midas Mulligan had vanished. He left his home one morning and was never heard from again. Mulligan had planned the closing in advance and in minute detail. No clue was ever found to his motive, and there was nobody to give an answer. And then Lee Hunsaker lets us know that, okay, so that guy, Midas Mulligan, just slipped out one day, just vanished, bam, gone. And every penny of his bank was accounted for. Everything was all there. Perfect exit. And Lee says, I applied for a loan. He turned me down flat. I brought suit against him. And how does he plan on suing a guy for not giving him a loan? It was an economic emergency law, which said that people were forbidden to discriminate for any reason whatever against any person in any matter involving his livelihood. Okay, so basically you have to give a loan to anybody who knocks at your door because if they want it for their livelihood. So I could basically go to the bank and be like, I need $1 million because my livelihood, and you got to give it to me because it's discrimination if you don't. That's the emergency law. So the trial had Judge Narragansett, one of those old-fashioned monks of the bench who thinks like a mathematician. He instructed the jury to bring a verdict in favor of Midas Mulligan. We appealed to a higher court. Higher courts reversed the verdict and ordered Mulligan to give us the loan on our terms. He had 3 months in which to comply, but before the 3 months were up, something happened that nobody can figure out. He vanished into thin air, he and his bank. There wasn't an extra penny left of that bank to collect our lawful claim. Now, Dagny thinks to herself, she's like, well, this guy was a beast. He probably faced a lot of crap like this. He wouldn't just disappear over this one issue, even though Lee Hunsacker's ego is so big and he's trying to write a novel about himself. And he had gotten a loan, obviously, from Eugene Lawson, but the factory didn't work out. And Lee Hunsacker basically bitches and complains and whines and moans about how he's writing a biography of his life. His life's so great, but it's everybody else's fault why I didn't succeed. And they didn't send him any money, and they didn't give him any good motors, and they didn't give him all the good tech and all this other nonsense. Then some newcomer that nobody ever heard of opened a 2-bit factory down in Colorado by the name of Nielsen Motors and put out a new motor of the same class as the Starnes model at half price. So Jed Starnes owned the 20th Century Motor Company. Hunsacker now owns it, and he can't compete with this guy who put out a motor just like Jed Starnes is because he doesn't know how to produce, but they gave him a loan to own the motor company. And by they, I mean Eugene Lawson, right? Do you see how ridiculous all this is? That Eugene Lawson's given a loan to Lee Hunsacker, who was suing Midas Mulligan, an emergency law for not giving him a loan because it affected his livelihood. Like, this is what these emergency laws do. They tighten things up, and then there goes Midas Mulligan. So now nobody can get a loan from him because he's gone. And obviously, maybe not just because of that, but because of nonsense like this, I'm sure. Did you hire any research men of your own? Yes, some. But people would wait for the laws of economic determinism to operate upon us. So he's basically saying that there's this, he's using economic determinism, which is a Marxist theory which claims society is based upon an economic system in which the various agents of social control are determined by the economic mode of production. So he's like, we couldn't gain control by being productive. They wouldn't just wait for us to basically take control. And he says that they never had a motor factory before. We had to let the tools condition our mind, but nobody gave us time. So this is this guy's mindset. Nobody gave us time, nobody gave us money, nobody gave us total control, societal control of the mode of production. Woe is me. That's Lee Hunsacker's deal. Who was the general manager of the factory? A very able fellow by the name of Roy Cunningham. He died last year in an auto accident. You don't happen to know what became of the Starnes heirs? They ran for cover, 3 of them, 2 sons and a daughter, hiding their faces out in Durance, Louisiana. So there we go. We found out where the Starnes family went. 2 sons and a daughter. We talked to Lee Hunsacker, who was the guy who got the loan to have the factory, but never produced anything, and that was gone. Now we're going to see the Starnes family. So Dagny goes to see them. The 3rd one is dead, suicide. He was the youngest, Eric Starnes. So she's talking to the chief of police now in Durance, Louisiana. He started running after a girl of 16. She married a boy she was engaged to. Eric Starnes got into their house on the wedding day. They found him in their bedroom, dead, messy, dead, his wrists slashed. The man who kills himself making a show of his death in order to hurt somebody, the man who gives his life for malice, there's no forgiveness for him, no excuse. He's rotten clear through, and what he deserves is what that people spit at his memory instead of feeling sorry for him and hurt as he wanted them to be. That's the sheriff's outtake on Eric Starnes' death. So he's gone. She found Gerald Starnes. And when Gerald Starnes spoke, the sound of a static, unfocused malevolence. So static, which is part of the motor and how that works. Converting static into electricity and vice versa. It went bust, a great factory. It's all rot, black rot, the automobiles, the buildings, and the souls, and it doesn't make any difference, one way or the other. There isn't any good. The ill-smelling bungalow where she found Ivy Starnes. So he tells her, go talk to my sister. There's nothing good in the world. Screw it. The universe sucks. I lost my factory. So we're down to the last Starnes. First one killed himself. The second one, just nuts. And the third one's not much better, but she found Ivy Starnes, hanging strands of moss and clots. So she's really going in on this, like blood clotting, the backing up of the flow, the drying up of the rivers. She's really just painting this picture that, there's an obstruction here and nothing is okay. And every time we try to make progress in finding out who made this motor, we basically hit one of these clots. The smell came from undusted corners and from incense burning in silver jars at the feet of contorted oriental deities. Her eyes were two lifeless puddles of water. Her voice had the even, dripping monotone of rain. I really like that description. Her eyes were two lifeless puddles of water. Her voice had the even, dripping monotone of rain. That was pretty good. Because when I actually heard this lady speaking, I could sort of hear that, like, cadence. My father was an evil man who cared for nothing but business, like something like that, right? My brothers and I lived on a different plane. Drip, drip, drip. We were defeated by the greed, the selfishness, and the base animal nature of men. It was the eternal conflict between spirit and matter, between soul and body. The engineers who started the hemophilia, yes, that is what I said. The slow leak, the loss of blood that cannot be stopped. So we go from clotting to just the loss of it all. The blood is gone. They ran first. They deserted us. We put into practice that noble historical precept, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Everybody received the same salary, the barest minimum necessary. Twice a year, every person presented his claim for what he believed to be his needs. We voted. The will of the majority established every person's need and every person's ability. These people are nuts. So they take over their father's factory and they're like, we live on a different plane and where everything is just sunshine and rainbows. And even the engineers made the same as the lowest employee and vice versa. And everybody makes the same amount of money. And so, yeah, they forgot like the first law of economics, right? Incentives matter. Well, what incentive does somebody as smart and as schooled and as learned as an engineer have to work for your company if they're getting paid the same as the guy who didn't go to school or who hasn't studied, who doesn't produce the most important part and lifeblood of the company? Yet they got to make the same low salary, and then everybody gets a say in what they make and what they should produce. Crazy. The will of the majority established every person's need and every person's ability. And we know about the will of the majority, right? It doesn't work, especially as your vote gets more and more watered down, right? There's a difference between having a room full of engineers make a vote about an engineering, who should head the engineering project or something. There's a total difference between now adding in the janitors, the cafeteria workers and everybody else and saying, now let's all make decisions about the head of, the engineering department together. They don't know enough to make that decision, to make that call. to decide what's fair because they're not living it day to day. And that's what we have going on. So rewards were based on need and the penalties on ability. Those whose needs were voted to be the greatest received the most. Those who had not produced as much as the vote said they could were fined and had to pay the fines by working overtime without pay. That was our plan. It required men to be motivated not by personal gain, but by love for their brothers. How nice. Except if they really love their brothers, and what they would do is allow the people who produce the most to make the most, so that they had an incentive to continue to produce, which would have kept a roof over everybody's head and kept the factory going so that these people could actually make what they were worth. And then if they made more, then they would have been more charitable and they would have been handing stuff out. But because they weren't making more, they couldn't be charitable with their family and friends. So you basically erase any sort of goodwill that, more productive people would have had to anybody else. Those who had not produced as much as the vote said they could were fined and had to pay the fines by working overtime without pay. That was our plan. It required men to be motivated not by personal gain, but by love for their brothers. So if you said you could produce 24 things and you only produced 10 in the year, you had to work overtime until you made the extra 14. How ridiculous is that? Dagny heard a cold, implacable voice saying, "Remember it well. It is not often that one can see pure evil. Look at it. Remember, and someday you'll find the words to name its essence." I hope soon, Rand gives us the words, because the way that she describes what we know about this method, these modes of operating government and politics, we know that they don't work. Everybody likes to buy into them all the time anyways. But the way that she fleshes it out in this book is such a good allegorical way of doing it. And it is evil, right? It is very evil to put everybody on this level and pretend like everybody's the same and give them the same pay and all this nonsense. It's, you're constantly dropping other people lower and ruining their incentives. And so it's like that classroom story I heard, which was a really good way of describing socialism and communism, right? Which is, if the whole class is graded as a whole, then the people who worked really, really hard and got A's carried the people who got like D's and C's and brought the grade up. So if you worked hard enough to get an A in your class and then overall you only got a B, the next time you don't work as hard because you're like, well, no matter how hard I work, the rest of the class is going to drag me down to a B. The people who didn't do a lot of work say, I don't need to work really hard because I would have just gotten a C and I got a B. So they stop working hard. The whole production drops of everybody, right? And then that's what happens, is that it's a race to the bottom because the people at the top have no incentive to continue getting A's and putting in that hard work. So the production drops. The people at the bottom already don't put in the work. So by the second or third test, right, everybody's grade's like an F, and that's the end. So in 4 years, a plan conceived not by the cold calculation of the mind, but by the pure love of heart was brought to an end in the sordid mess of policemen, lawyers, and bankruptcy proceedings. And we know that this plan wasn't from the love of the heart. This is just some twisted way of thinking, because if you actually love people, right, you don't try and take the paintbrushes and the oil paints away from the most talented artists in the room, because they can produce the most beautiful images and they can teach other people how to produce beautiful things as well. They can elevate the whole room themselves. You wouldn't say, let's distribute these things evenly among everybody so that you don't have the necessary colors to produce the most amazing artwork, and then give it to people who are basically like, I don't know, finger painting, right? I think that's sort of where we're at. Oh, yes, yes, I know that one. The chief engineer. So Dagny gets really mad because she's like, I don't remember anybody and this and that. But she said it in that monotone dripping sound. But Dagny was about to kill this woman because she was like, I'm so sick of your evil shit. And she just stares daggers through her. And finally she cracks and she's like, yes, yes, I know that one. The chief engineer. Yes, he was the head of the laboratory. William Hastings. That was his name. William Hastings. I remember he went off to Brandon, Wyoming. Finally, we have a name of an engineer who worked at that place under the Starnes family. So we go to see William Hastings. Bare tree branches cut across the bright, cold blue of the sky. Silver gray sunlight, crystal stand of a lamp, red dotted white. My husband died 5 years ago, Miss Taggart. So we find out Will Hastings is dead. Ugh, we just can't win. I've always felt that something happened at the 20th Century Motors, which he would not tell me. So, all right, we're making progress. She knows that something might be up. Her husband didn't say something. The engineering department of Acme Motors, he was not a person prone to inner conflicts, but for a whole year after he left Wisconsin, he acted as if he were tortured by something, as if he was struggling with a personal problem he could not solve. There was nothing strange in his behavior or activity except that at times, very rarely, he went out without telling me where he went or whom he saw. In the last 2 years of his life, he went away for 1 month each summer. He studied a great deal and he spent his time on engineering research of his own. I don't know what he did with his notes and experimental models. I found no trace of them in the basement after his death. And then Dagny's like, well, a motor? A motor? She gets so excited, right? A motor, yes, yes. He spoke of it several times. He said it was an invention of incalculable importance, but it was not he who had designed it. It was the invention of a young assistant of his. Now we're getting somewhere. We find out that Bill Hastings over here, Will Hastings, had an assistant. This young assistant's the guy that produced the motor. Who is he? I don't know. He told me only that he had a young engineer who someday would turn up in the world. I remember that day he told me that the motor was completed, how his voice sounded when he said, and he's only 26. This was about a month before the death of Jed Starnes. So now we know what age this kid was. We know it was a month before Jed Starnes died. And here we have this motor, and maybe the two were linked. Because this kid's working on this motor, it's a big project, and then Jed Starnes is gone. It's strange because you see, I asked my husband what had become of that invention he'd said was so great. He looked at me very oddly and answered, nothing. I could tell you where to find one friend of his. I saw him standing outside the restaurant with two men. One of them was young and tall. My husband pointed after the young man and said, did you see him? That's the boy I told you about. That's the one who's the great maker of motors, the one who was. There was a distinguished gray-haired man behind the counter. So Dagny goes to find this guy that was with this young man who built the motor with William Hastings in the engineering lab at 20th Century Motor Company. And this is kind of a long chapter. Like, a lot has been happening, and we've just kind of had to go through it because we have to flesh out all this information. So it's on Route 86 in the mountains west of Cheyenne near a small industrial settlement by the Lennox Copper Foundry. It seems strange, but I'm certain of it. The cook in that diner is the man I saw at the railroad station with my husband's young idol. So there we are at sunset. It's dark below the small pool left behind by a receding tide. I like that. So she's like a small pool of sunlight left behind by a receding tide because they're up on this mountain in Wyoming. So faint that it vanished if one tried to discern it. A note of humor when she was talking to the guy. So they talk, basically. She finds out
a little bit about him. He makes like the best burgers in the world, supposedly. May I ask what has aroused your interest in him? His motor. How did you happen to know about his motor? What is your name? She asked the guy. Hugh Axton. Well, she knew that this was the Hugh Axton. So Hugh Axton was Danconia's teacher. Hugh Axton, she stammered, the philosopher, the last of the advocates of reason? Why, yes, he answered pleasantly, or the first of their return. Dr. Axton, it's inconceivable. You're a philosopher, the greatest philosopher living, an immortal name. Would you do this? So why would you waste your philosophy talents on cooking burgers, basically? If you find it inconceivable that an invention of genius should be abandoned among ruins, and that a philosopher should wish to work as a cook in a diner, check your premises. You will find that one of them is wrong. So why would these people wish to abandon these big projects and go cook burgers in a diner and go do other things? Probably because they know the game is rigged. They know that there are looters who would steal their production using the law. And so she remembered that she had heard this before, and that it was Francisco who had said it. Because remember, at the party, Francisco had said, if you ever find that, if you find a contradiction, so if the contradictions cannot exist, and if they do, then you need to check your premise if you find yourself in a contradiction. She remembered that she heard that before. And tell me, are you proud of the way these three have turned out? She asked. Because remember, this guy had the three students. There was Danconia, there was the mystery student, and oh yeah, there was the pirate Ragnar Danishul, who turned out to be a pirate. And he said, more proud than I had ever hoped to be. So he's actually proud of these three people. Train number 57 was lined along the track. She looked at the lighted windows on train 57. Train 57 was about to start down the track of the John Galt line. They're not laws, they're directives. Then it's illegal. It's not illegal because the legislator passed a law last month giving him the power to issue directives. So now they're coming out with directives instead of laws. She's listening to two men behind her on the train. The railroads of the country were ordered to reduce the maximum speed of all trains to 60 miles per hour, to reduce the maximum length of all trains to 60 cars, and to run the same number of trains in every state of a zone composed of 5 neighboring states. So these are the directives, which are, no differences. We're going to tell you what to do and you're going to do it. The steel mills of the country are ordered to limit the maximum production of any metal alloy to an amount equal to the production of other metal alloys by other mills placed in the same classification of plant capacity. All the manufacturing establishments of the country of any size and nature were forbidden to move from their present locations except when granted a special permission to do so by the Bureau of Economic Planning and Natural Resources. So now we need government permission to move our own private company somewhere else, even though they're limiting our production. So it's not about production. It's about control, right? To provide the funds for the personnel to enforce these directives, a special tax was imposed on the state of Colorado. So now we have to have directives that limit our production, and then we have to have tax money go to people who are going to enforce the directives that limit our production. As the state best able to assist the needier states to bear the brunt of the national emergency, such tax to consist of 5% of the gross sales of Colorado's industrial concerns. It was Ellis Wyatt filling her consciousness. She had to reach Ellis Wyatt and stop him. She did not know what it was that she had to prevent. She knew only that she had to stop him. So these directives are coming out. There's a new tax in Colorado. And that's where Ellis Wyatt operates out of. So she gets that hint of intuition like, whoa, I need to get to Ellis Wyatt right now. She would know that action is man's foremost obligation regardless of anything he feels. The tax on Colorado, she thought, the tax collected from Ellis Wyatt to pay for the livelihood of those whose jobs was to tie him and make him unable to live, those who would stand on guard to see that he got no trains, no tank cars, no pipeline of Rearden metal. Ellis Wyatt, stripped of the right of self-defense, left without voice, without weapons, and worse, made to be the tool of his own destruction because he has to pay taxes to support the people who are supporting the directives which are putting him out of business. made to be the tool of his own destruction, the supporter of his own destroyers, the provider of their food and of their weapons. Ellis Wyatt being choked with his own bright energy turned against him as the noose. Ellis Wyatt, who had wanted to tap an unlimited source of shale oil and who spoke of a second renaissance. In a break between the mountains, lighting the sky, throwing a glow that swayed on the roofs and walls of the station, the hill of Wyatt oil was a solid sheet of flame. I am leaving it as I found it. They found a sign handwritten on the board, take over, it's yours. So Ellis Wyatt is out. He's gone. He's done. That's why the chapter is called Wyatt's Torch. That's where we're at. And yeah, it's a lot because we journey from the clerk in the records office to the mayor, to Eugene Lawson, to Lee Hunsacker, to the Starnes family, to that lady who was married to Will Hastings, to the guy who's the cook, who is actually Hugh Axton, the philosopher, the philosophy teacher of Danconia. And then we go to find that Ellis Wyatt has burned the fields of his oil field and said, you know what, take over now. You see if you can do anything with it. Because I'm not going to pay you taxes. I'm not going to pay you to put a gun to my head. I'm not going to pay you to enforce these directives on me, to limit my production. I'm not going to allow you to loot me, because that's what it is, right? Taxation being theft of this guy's money. They're stealing it to pay for laws that shouldn't be laws. This is non-constitutional. Just creating crap out of thin air so that there's nothing this guy can do. They're tying his hands because they want his stuff. And there we are. And now we have to see what happens because Wyatt just torched his whole joint. And obviously Rearden's pissed. He's having those issues with his wife, who's, I mean, her mind is like mush, filled with garbage. So we've got a lot going on. And they're limiting Rearden's ability to pour and put out metals and his ability to get the materials that he needs for his metals. So that was part one. We just finished. Congratulations if you made it this far through part one. We're going on to part two. And things are about to really heat up because where do you go from here when Ellis Wyatt's whole field is, been destroyed? And we have this line, this whole John Galt line that was basically built off the back of the fact that he was producing so much. Who's going to take his place? What's going to happen? Is he going to come back? Will we find out what went down? We'll have to see. So I will see you next time. Get ready for part two, chapter one. See you soon.
And just so you know, when she went to see Hugh Axton, Danconia's philosophy teacher, I was all caught up in breaking it down that I forgot to say that he did know the guy who built the motor, which I mentioned slightly, but that he would not reveal who it was to Dagny and told her not to go searching for him because she won't find him, and that when he was ready, he would contact her. I can't believe I left that one piece out, but all right. Part two. See you soon.